and through.
Okay, so we're going to put a bias binding around this armhole. I've sewn the shoulder seam and that's been overlocked and pressed towards the back. This is my front here. But what we're going to do is, because we finish on the outside, we're going to start sewing on the inside, so on the wrong side, so make sure your shoulder seam's facing up. And we're going to use this bias binding here. This is a pure cotton one, so it's quite stiff. You can see it's got a bit of give, but not that much. You can also buy you're more likely to find now poly cotton binds, which do have a bit more give and they're a bit easier to manipulate. So you can see here on the outside two folded edges. On the inside you can see these little tucked under, like little seam allowances. So we're going to sew on those. So when you position the bias under the foot and under the needle, we want the needle to go just on the right side of that fold there. So we're not sewing on the actual main flap section, just on the seam allowance. So I'm going to just give this a gentle pull as we go around. Now I'm pulling slightly on the bias, so don't pull on the armhole at all, because if you pull on the armhole and then sew, it's just going to keep that stretched. It'll stretch it and it'll stay stretched. But we're pulling on the bias a little bit just for it to go around the curves. And so line the raw edges up, just do it section by section, just a couple of centimetres at a time. Okay, so you can see how that's standing up away. That's good. And you can see that the armhole has kept its original shape as well. It hasn't been stretched. So I'm just going to clip off the bias here, and I'm going to, what am I doing next? I'm now going to fold this over, and you can see where the original stitch line was. And the idea now is to fold this again. Now remember, this is the outside of the garment, so you're going to fold it over and fold it over the original row of stitching so that can't be seen. A little back tack, and then see this. And the nice thing about this being cotton bias is that it's quite easy to manipulate with your fingers and to press it into position. Okay, that's worked out quite nicely. And of course we've sewn in black so that you can see where the stitch lines are, but if it was in a matching colour, that would obviously be a lot less obvious. So I'm just going to stop now, and I'm going to, actually, no, not just yet. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to sew the side seam. So, and a nice way of, because we're starting the stitch line right from the top, it's nice to start off with both of the threads being pulled towards the back, because it means that even though the top thread, when it's pulled at the back, like that stays out of the way, but then the bottom thread can actually, sort of bunch up behind. So if you pull both of them back, you get a much nicer finish where the stitching started. So we want the raw edges to match up perfectly at the top here. Just hold them in position, and we're sewing this at a 1 centimetre seam allowance. I usually hold both threads towards the back, so a little back tack, and then 1 centimetre seam allowance down. And you can see here, see that's the front and that's the back. So when I snip that off, you really do get like a nice finish there, and you don't get the big clump that would usually happen if you just do a regular back tack. I'm just going to overlock this now, and then I'll come back and just finish this off. So I've overlocked the side seam here, and I've given it a press. I pressed it towards the back, so that's what it looks like on the outside, and you can see because I matched up the edges of the bias there, we've got a nice flow through. I didn't cut the overlocking all the way back here, because if you do that, it'll just sort of start to come undone. So I've got a couple of centimeters there, and so just to finish this off, I'm just going to give it a bit. Well, actually, I'm giving it a pull, but it's not really doing very much. So I'm going to trim it back a little bit more, maybe just to like 1.5 centimeters or so. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this and that end of the overlocking underneath there, and I'm going to go to the outside, and I'm going to stitch this here so that seam allowance is held back by that outside stitching. So again, like when we started the top of the seam here, I'm just going to pull both my threads up to the top, make sure that the overlocking's tucked under, flip it to the outside, and you can see because the edge of the seam allowance is actually tucked under there a bit, I'm going to just run that row of stitching along the stitch line that's already there. If they were matching at the top, I'd probably just do a little stitch there, but because it's on an angle underneath, I'm going to run that up to stitch it in place. Okay, so both threads towards the back, and then just back tack, and then just to the edge of the seam, so I've stitched from about there to there. So on the outside, just trimming that, and on the inside, giving that a little trim, and trim off my 2 edges there. And that's the finish. And just one last thing is that some people get a bit worried if on the inside the thread hasn't caught, like the stitching hasn't gone on top of the bias on the inside. It's not really a worry. Again, you know, if it matches, it'll tone in anyway, the thread colour. It's more important that you get it looking good on the outside than the inside. And there's your bound armhole.